Story number 1.
When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought it was perfect. The small cul-de-sac was quiet, the houses well kept, and the neighbors polite enough to wave but not overly intrusive. It was exactly what I needed after my divorce. A fresh start, a clean slate. My house was at the end of the street, bordered by a tall hedge that separated my yard from the house next door. That house was older, with faded paint and a sagging porch. I rarely saw anyone coming or going from there. The blinds were always drawn, and the overgrown lawn hinted that whoever lived there wasn't much for upkeep. One morning, while I was taking out the trash, I saw her for the first time. A woman, maybe in her mid-50s, standing at her window, staring out at me. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and she didn't move, just stood there, watching. It startled me at first, but I managed an awkward wave. She didn't respond, just turned away and disappeared into the shadows of the house. I mentioned it to Carol, the neighbor across the street, a few days later. She gave me a strange look. "No one's lived there for years," she said. "That's not possible," I replied. "I've seen her. She was at the window." Carol shook her head. "That house has been empty since Mr. Hargrove passed away. His wife disappeared years before that, and they never found her." I laughed nervously. "You're kidding, right?" Carol's face was deadly serious. "You didn't hear it from me, but people around here say the house is strange. Kids dare each other to go inside, but no one stays long. You should keep your distance." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I sat in my living room reading, I glanced at the window and froze. The blinds in the house next door had been drawn back slightly, and she was there again, staring. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Carol was wrong, and someone had moved in without her noticing. Still, the woman's expression unnerved me. There was something in her eyes, something hollow. The next day, I decided to introduce myself. I walked over and knocked on the door, but no one answered. The house felt wrong. The air around it was heavier, colder. I peeked through one of the front windows, but the inside was dark and empty. Dust coated the furniture and cobwebs stretched across the ceiling. When I stepped back, I noticed the woman watching me again, this time from an upstairs window. Her gaze bore into me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing noises, creaks and thuds coming from the direction of the neighbor's house. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the old house settling, but deep down I knew better. A week later, things escalated. I came home from work to find muddy footprints leading from the neighbor's yard to my back door. My heart raced as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. That night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold, a faint tapping at my bedroom window. My house is a single story, so anyone standing outside would be able to reach it easily. But when I gathered the courage to look, no one was there. The next morning, I found handprints on the glass, small, pale handprints that didn't belong to me. I called the police. They checked the house next door and found nothing unusual. "It's probably kids messing around," one of the officers said. "These old neighborhoods have a way of attracting troublemakers." I wanted to believe him, but the incidents kept happening. Doors I knew I'd locked would be standing open. Objects in my house would be moved. And always, I would catch glimpses of her watching me from her window. One night, around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of my front door creaking open. My heart pounded as I grabbed a baseball bat and crept down the hall. The door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. I stepped outside, scanning the yard. The street was empty, silent except for the rustle of leaves. Then I saw her, standing at the edge of my driveway. "Who are you?" I shouted, gripping the bat tightly. She didn't respond, didn't move. Her face was pale, her eyes dark hollows, and she seemed almost translucent in the moonlight. And then she vanished. I ran back inside, locking every door and window. Sleep was impossible. I stayed up until dawn, clutching the bat and jumping at every sound. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I started packing, determined to leave the house and its eerie neighbor behind. As I was loading boxes into my car, Carol came over. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her brow furrowed. I nodded. "I can't stay here. That house. There's something wrong with it." She looked over at the Whitaker house and sighed. "You're not the first. The last family who lived here left after just a month. said they couldn't handle the strange happenings. That night, my last in the house, I heard it again, the tapping at the window. I didn't look this time. I didn't need to. I knew she was there, watching, waiting. I left before sunrise, never looking back. Months later, I heard that the Whitaker house had been torn down. They found something in the basement, bones, decades old, the remains of a woman who had gone missing years before. I don't know what she wanted from me, but I still see her in my nightmares, standing at her window, staring. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
When I first moved into the small suburban neighborhood, it seemed idyllic. The houses were tidy, the lawns well-maintained, and the residents friendly, but not overly nosy. My new house was at the end of the street with only one neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Hensley, living next door. Her house was large and imposing, with peeling paint, dark windows, and a yard full of overgrown shrubs. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. She keeps to herself, my realtor had said when I asked about her. Harmless, bit of a recluse. The first time I saw her, I was unloading boxes from my car. She was standing on her porch, motionless, watching me. Her face was gaunt, her hair gray and unkempt, and her expression blank. I waved politely, but she didn't respond. She just turned and went back inside, her screen door creaking shut behind her. That night, as I unpacked, I couldn't shake the image of her staring at me. Something about her eyes had unsettled me, but I brushed it off as nerves from the move. A few nights later, I was jolted awake by a sound outside. It was faint at first, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. I got up and peeked out the window. The street was deserted, but Mrs. Hensley's house had a single light on in one of the upstairs windows. The next morning, I decided to introduce myself properly. I walked over and knocked on her door. The wood felt soft and splintered under my knuckles. For a long moment, there was no sound from inside, but just as I was about to leave, the door creaked open. Mrs. Hensley stood there, her face partially obscured by the shadow of the doorway. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Hi, I'm your new neighbor," I said, forcing a smile. "I just wanted to say hello." She stared at me for an uncomfortably long time before nodding slightly. "Hello," she said, then closed the door without another word. That night, as I sat in my living room reading, I heard it again, the dragging sound. This time it was louder, closer. I turned off the lights and looked out the window. In the pale glow of the streetlight, I saw her. Mrs. Hensley was dragging a large black bag across her yard, her movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't see what was in the bag, but it was bulky and left a trail in the dirt. My stomach turned as I watched her disappear behind her house. The next morning, I walked over to her yard, pretending to check my mailbox. The trail in the dirt was still there, leading to the back of her house. I followed it cautiously, my heart pounding. Behind the house was a dilapidated shed, its door hanging off one hinge. The trail ended there. I considered knocking again, asking her what I'd seen, but something about the silence around the shed made me uneasy. I hurried back to my house, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. Over the next few weeks, strange things continued to happen. I'd hear footsteps outside my window at night, but when I looked, no one was there. Small objects in my house seemed to move on their own. Keys I'd left on the counter would appear on the floor, and lights I'd turned off would be on again. The worst was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just when I was outside. It was inside my home, too. No matter where I was, I felt eyes on me, cold and unrelenting. One night, the dragging sound woke me again, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a faint tapping on my bedroom window. I froze, my heart racing. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, soft and deliberate. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling, and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The yard outside was empty, but I could feel something, a presence, lingering just beyond the edge of the light. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I decided to install security cameras around my house. If someone or something was messing with me, I wanted proof. The cameras were easy to set up, and by evening, I felt a little safer knowing they were there. That night, as I reviewed the live feed before bed, my stomach dropped. One of the cameras, the one facing Mrs. Hensley's house, was glitching. The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw her standing at her window, staring directly at the camera. Then the screen went black. I ran outside to check the camera, but it was fine. Still powered on, no sign of tampering. When I looked up at her house, the window was dark again, and the oppressive silence of the night settled around me. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I called the local police to do a welfare check on Mrs. Hensley. They assured me they'd send someone out, but I could tell from their tone they thought I was overreacting. When the officers arrived, I watched from my window as they knocked on her door. She answered, speaking to them briefly before they left. One of the officers came to my house afterward. "She seems fine," he said. "Bit of a loner, but there's no law against that. She said she hasn't noticed anything unusual." I thanked him and closed the door, frustration bubbling inside me. Either Mrs. Hensley was lying or I was losing my mind. That night, the security cameras picked up something I'll never forget. Around 2 a.m., the camera facing my backyard captured movement. A figure, tall, gaunt, and unmistakably Mrs. Hensley, was standing at the edge of my yard, staring at my house. She stood there for what felt like hours, unmoving, before turning and walking back toward her home. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay there any longer. A few weeks later, I learned from a neighbor that Mrs. Hensley had passed away. The mail carrier found her body after noticing letters piling up on her porch. She'd been dead for weeks, long before I'd moved in. The house was boarded up shortly after, but even now, I can't drive past it without feeling her eyes on me. I don't know who or what was watching me, but I'll never forget the way she looked, standing in my yard, her hollow eyes fixed on my house.
Story number 3.
When I first moved into the neighborhood, I was excited about the change. After years of apartment living, the little house at the end of Pinewood Lane felt like a dream. It had a quaint garden, a cozy porch, and most importantly, friendly neighbors, or so I thought. The house next door to mine was older, its paint peeling and shutters hanging crookedly. Unlike the other well-maintained homes on the street, this one seemed neglected. The lawn was overgrown, and the mailbox leaned precariously to one side. I didn't see anyone coming or going from it for weeks after I moved in, but one afternoon while I was watering my plants, I saw a man standing at the window. He was older, with wild gray hair and a scruffy beard. His eyes were deep set, and his gaze was piercing. He stared at me for a long moment before disappearing behind the curtain. I felt a chill but shrugged it off, convincing myself he was just a reclusive neighbor. I decided I'd introduce myself the next time I saw him. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I saw him standing at the edge of his yard, staring at my house. His presence was unsettling, but I gathered my courage and approached him. "Hi there," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm your new neighbor, Emily." He didn't respond right away, just kept staring. Then, in a low, gravelly voice, he said, "You shouldn't have moved here." I laughed nervously. "Well, it's a nice neighborhood, and They don't like new people," he interrupted, his voice sharper this time. "They don't like strangers." I frowned. "Who doesn't?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back into his house, leaving me standing there in confusion. That night, I couldn't shake his words. As I lay in bed, I kept hearing faint noises, footsteps outside, the creak of a door, whispers I couldn't quite make out. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of an unsettling encounter. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The next morning, I asked one of my other neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Parker, about the man next door. "Oh, that's Mr. Harris," she said, lowering her voice. "He's lived there for decades, but he's odd, keeps to himself." "Has he always been like that?" I asked. She hesitated. "There were rumors years ago about his wife. She disappeared one night, and no one ever saw her again. The police investigated, but nothing ever came of it. Some people think she just left him, but others..." "Others what?" I pressed. Mrs. Parker shook her head. "You don't want to get mixed up with him, dear. Just keep your distance." Despite her warning, I couldn't help but feel drawn to the mystery. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on Mr. Harris's house, but I didn't see him again. The noises at night continued, though, growing louder and more distinct. One night, I woke to the sound of something scraping against my bedroom window. My heart pounded as I slowly got up and pulled back the curtain, but there was nothing there, just the empty yard and the shadows of the trees. The following day, I decided to investigate. I walked over to Mr. Harris's house and knocked on the door. There was no answer, but I could hear movement inside. Footsteps, faint and shuffling. I knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open, and Mr. Harris stood there, his face pale and gaunt. "What do you want?" he snapped. "I've been hearing strange noises at night," I said. "I thought maybe you." "Stay out of it," he interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Before I could respond, he slammed the door in my face. That night, the noises were worse than ever. I heard whispers again, clearer this time, like they were coming from inside the house. And then there were footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway outside my bedroom. I locked my door and stayed awake until dawn, clutching a flashlight and trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I noticed something strange. In the dirt outside my window, there were footprints. Bare, human footprints that led from Mr. Harris's house to mine, and then back again. I called the police, but when they arrived, there was no sign of anyone. They checked Mr. Harris's house, but he wasn't home. "Probably just kids playing a prank," one of the officers said. But I wasn't convinced. That evening, as the sun set, I saw Mr. Harris again. He was standing in his yard, staring at my house. I decided to confront him. "What's going on?" I demanded as I approached him. "Are you the one leaving footprints outside my window?" He didn't answer. Instead, he said, "They're watching you now. You shouldn't have come here." "Who's watching me?" I asked, my frustration growing. "What are you talking about?" He gave me a long, searching look before saying, "You'll see soon enough." That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard the whispers again, louder this time. They seemed to be coming from all around me, filling the house with an eerie, disembodied murmur. And then, for the first time, I saw them. Shadowy figures, faint and translucent, moving through the house. They didn't seem to notice me at first, but as I stood frozen in terror, one of them turned its head and looked directly at me. Its eyes were hollow, its face contorted in a grotesque expression of rage. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I was standing in the middle of the street. When I turned back, the house was dark and silent again. But in the window of Mr. Harris's house, I saw him standing there, watching me. I didn't go back inside that night. I stayed at a friend's house and returned the next day to pack my things. As I was loading the last box into my car, Mrs. Parker came over. "You're leaving?" she asked. "I have to," I said. "There's something wrong with that house, with this neighborhood." She nodded slowly. "You're not the first to say that." I never saw Mr. Harris again, but I still think about him, about his cryptic warnings and the way he always seemed to know more than he let on. I don't know who or what was in that house, but I know I'll never go back to Pinewood Lane. Story the end.
Story number 4.
When I moved into the small rental house on Ashwood Drive, I was eager to start fresh. It wasn't much, just a 2-bedroom bungalow with creaky floors and an overgrown backyard, but it was mine, and that was enough. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with families and retirees, except for the house next door. The property was nearly identical to mine, but it seemed off. The lawn was unkempt, the blinds were always drawn, and there was an eerie stillness about it. My landlord had said the tenant next door kept to himself, but no one could tell me much about him. The first time I saw him, it was late one evening. I was unloading groceries when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Turning toward the house next door, I saw a man standing at the window, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of a lamp. He didn't wave or nod, just stood there, staring at me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but forced myself to wave. He didn't respond. The curtain dropped and the light disappeared. The next morning, I decided to introduce myself. I knocked on his door, my knuckles hesitant against the weathered wood. After a long pause, the door creaked open, just enough for me to see a sliver of his face. "Hi," I said, forcing a smile. "I just moved in next door. I thought I'd say hello." He stared at me, his pale blue eyes hollow and sunken. His skin was ashen, and his lips barely moved when he muttered, "You should leave." I blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he shut the door, leaving me standing on the porch with my heart pounding. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something deeply unsettling about his demeanor, his words. As I lay in bed, I heard faint noises outside, a soft scraping sound like someone dragging something heavy across the pavement. Peeking out the window, I saw the man from next door. He was in his yard, crouched over something I couldn't make out. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he were struggling against an unseen force. I pulled the curtains closed and told myself it was none of my business. The strange noises continued over the next few nights. Footsteps on my porch, the sound of whispering outside my window, and once a soft tapping on the glass that made my blood run cold. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, the house settling, anything but what it felt like. Someone or something watching me. One night, I woke up to the sound of my front door creaking open. My heart raced as I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the living room. The door was ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. I flicked on the porch light, but no one was there. My neighbor's house was dark, the blinds tightly shut as always. I locked the door, double-checked all the windows, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, clutching the lamp like a weapon. The next morning, I noticed something strange. In the dirt outside my window were footprints. They were barefoot, leading from my house to the neighbor's yard and back again. I decided to call the landlord. When I mentioned the strange happenings and my neighbor's behavior, she hesitated. "There's something you should know," she said finally. "The man who lived next door, Mr. Carter, he passed away about a month ago." I froze. "What?" "He was sick for a long time," she continued. "The house has been empty ever since. We haven't rented it out yet." My stomach turned. "That's not possible. I've seen him. I talked to him." "I don't know what to tell you," she said, her voice uneasy. "Maybe you should call the police." That evening, as the sun set, I couldn't bring myself to stay inside. Instead, I stood on my porch, staring at the darkened house next door. My landlord must have been mistaken, I thought. There had to be an explanation. I decided to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, I walked over to the neighbor's yard. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as I approached the front door. It was unlocked, and with a deep breath, I pushed it open. The house was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of mildew. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in weeks. I made my way through the dimly lit rooms, my flashlight casting long, flickering shadows. In the living room, I found an old armchair facing the window where I'd first seen the man. A blanket was draped over the back, and a cup of tea sat on the table beside it, untouched, but covered in a layer of dust. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the hallway. "Leave." My breath caught in my throat. The voice was low, rasping, and unmistakably his. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure at the end of the hallway, a gaunt man with pale blue eyes, staring at me. I didn't wait to find out more. I bolted from the house, my heart pounding, and didn't stop running until I was back in my own home, the door locked firmly behind me. The noises stopped after that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A week later, I moved out, leaving the house and its secrets behind. I never went back to Ashwood Drive, but sometimes I dream about the neighbor I never really had, his hollow eyes watching me from the window. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
When I moved into the quaint suburban neighborhood on Sycamore Lane, everything seemed perfect. The houses were charming, the streets were quiet, and the neighbors appeared friendly, all except for the house directly next to mine. It stood slightly askew, with its peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. It looked as though it had been forgotten. During the first few days, I noticed something peculiar about the house. The blinds were always drawn, and the front door never opened. Yet at night, I would see a faint light flickering through one of the upstairs windows, like an old lamp struggling to stay alive. It wasn't until I met my other neighbors, Sarah and her husband Ben, that I brought up the house next door. We were standing in my driveway, chatting about the area, when I asked, "Do you know who lives in that house?" Sarah's smile faltered, and Ben shifted uncomfortably. "That's the Thompson house," Sarah said quietly. "No one's lived there for years." I frowned. "That can't be right. I've seen lights on at night." Sarah exchanged a glance with Ben before saying, "It's best to leave that house alone. Some places carry bad energy." Their cryptic response left me unsettled, but I decided not to press further. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound from next door. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. a soft creak like someone walking on old floorboards. I sat up, straining to hear. It was faint, but unmistakable, the rhythmic sound of footsteps pacing back and forth. I told myself it was just the house settling, maybe even raccoons, and tried to go back to sleep. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take a closer look at the Thompson house. As I approached the yard, the air seemed to grow colder and the faint smell of damp earth lingered. The mailbox was rusted shut and the porch steps creaked under my weight. I knocked on the door, more out of habit than expectation. No one answered, of course. But as I turned to leave, I thought I heard a soft whisper, so faint I wasn't even sure it was real. Leave. I froze, my heart hammering. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The street was eerily quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Shaking off the unease, I walked back to my house. But the feeling of being watched lingered, like unseen eyes following my every step. That night, the noises began again. Soft footsteps, faint whispers, and an occasional thud, like something heavy being dropped. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But when I glanced out my bedroom window, I saw a shadow moving in the upstairs window of the Thompson house. The shadow was tall and indistinct, but it was definitely the shape of a person. They stood perfectly still, facing my house. I stared back, frozen with fear, until the shadow slowly backed away and disappeared into the darkness. I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went to Sarah and Ben's house, desperate for answers. "Something's not right with that house," I said, my voice trembling. Sarah sighed, looking genuinely troubled. "There's a reason no one goes near it," she said. "The Thompsons who used to live there, they were a quiet family, parents and a little girl. One day they just disappeared. No one knows what happened to them. The house has been empty ever since." "But I've seen someone inside," I insisted. "I've heard noises." Ben shook his head. "You're not seeing someone. You're seeing something. People say the house is cursed, haunted. Whatever it is, you don't want to mess with it." Their words only deepened my fear, but part of me refused to believe it. There had to be a logical explanation. That night, I resolved to figure out what was going on. I stayed up late, watching the Thompson house from my living room window. Around midnight, the light in the upstairs window flickered on again, faint and ghostly. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. As I crossed the yard, the cold air seemed to wrap around me like a vice. The closer I got to the house, the heavier the atmosphere felt. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The interior of the house was dark and musty, the air thick with decay. My flashlight beam revealed cobwebs draping every corner, the furniture covered in dust and draped in sheets. The place looked abandoned, yet it felt alive, as though the walls themselves were watching me. I made my way upstairs, my footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. The faint light I'd seen from my window seemed to be coming from the end of the hallway. My heart pounded as I approached the door, which was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I stepped inside. The room was empty, save for an old rocking chair in the corner. The chair was swaying gently, as if someone had just risen from it. But there was no one there. And then I saw it. A small, dusty picture frame sitting on the windowsill. I picked it up and wiped away the grime, revealing a photo of a little girl. She looked no older than 6, with curly hair and a shy smile. Behind her stood a man and woman, presumably her parents. A sudden chill ran through me as I realized the girl's eyes seemed to be looking directly at me. Not just in the photo, but through it, like she was watching me. And then I heard it. The soft sound of giggling. It was faint, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but the room was empty. The giggling grew louder, echoing around me until it abruptly stopped. In the deafening silence that followed, I heard a single word whispered right into my ear. "Leave." I dropped the flashlight and ran, stumbling down the stairs and out into the night. I didn't stop until I was back in my house, locking the door behind me. The noises from the Thompson house didn't stop after that, but I refused to acknowledge them. I ignored the shadows in the window, the whispers in the night, and the sense of being watched. A month later, I broke my lease and moved away. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced in that house. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the little girl in the photograph, her hollow eyes staring at me, her voice echoing in my mind. Leave. Story the end.
Story number 6.
When I first moved into my modest apartment in a quiet residential neighborhood, I thought I had hit the jackpot. The rent was affordable, the neighbors seemed friendly, and the area had an old-world charm that I found irresistible. My next-door neighbor was an elderly woman named Mrs. Lorraine. She lived alone, and I often heard her humming old songs through the walls. Her voice, though frail, was comforting, a reminder that I wasn't truly alone. I didn't meet her in person until a week after I moved in. I had baked a batch of cookies and decided to bring some over as a gesture of goodwill. When she answered the door, she smiled warmly, her wrinkled face lighting up with gratitude. "Thank you, dear," she said in a soft, quavering voice. Not many people think of the old these days. Over the weeks that followed, I began to notice strange things about Mrs. Lorraine. At night, I would hear her talking, though it sounded like she was speaking to someone. I assumed she might be on the phone, but the conversations didn't make sense. They were one-sided with long pauses in between, as if she were listening to someone else speak. Once, while I was returning home from work, I caught sight of her in her window. She was sitting in her armchair, staring into the darkness with a blank expression. Something about the way she sat, so rigid and motionless, gave me an odd sense of unease. One evening, as I was unlocking my door, she stepped out of her apartment. "Could you do me a favor?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course," I said. She handed me a small, dusty box. "Could you take this to the basement for me? My knees aren't what they used to be." I nodded and took the box from her. It was surprisingly heavy, and something inside shifted as I carried it. When I reached the basement, I found a row of old storage units, each marked with apartment numbers. Hers was unlocked, so I placed the box inside and turned to leave. But as I walked away, I heard a faint sound, like a whisper. "Help me," it said. I froze, my heart pounding. I turned back toward the storage unit, but it was silent. Shaking my head, I told myself it was just my imagination and hurried back upstairs. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whisper lingered in my mind, replaying over and over until it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. Around midnight, I heard something through the wall. It wasn't her usual humming or talking. This time it was a low, guttural moaning, like someone in pain. The next morning, I decided to check on Mrs. Lorraine. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. Concerned, I called the building manager, who unlocked the door for me. We found her sitting in her armchair, her eyes closed, her hands clutching the arms of the chair. She wasn't breathing. "She must have passed in her sleep," the manager said solemnly. But something didn't feel right. Her expression wasn't peaceful. It was strained, as if she had been frightened in her final moments. After the paramedics came to take her away, I tried to go back to my normal routine, but things only got worse. That night, I heard the moaning again. It was louder this time, more insistent. And then there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, no one was there. But I felt a cold breeze sweep past me, and the faint scent of lavender, the same perfume Mrs. Lorraine used to wear, lingered in the air. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and I kept hearing whispers, faint but unmistakable. "Help me," they said. Desperate for answers, I went to the basement. I found her storage unit and opened it, hoping to find something that would explain what was happening. Inside, I saw the box she had asked me to carry down, along with other old belongings, photo albums, letters, and a small porcelain doll that seemed to watch me with its lifeless eyes. I opened the box. Inside was an old diary. Flipping through the brittle pages, I found entries written in a shaky hand. They spoke of a man she once loved who had died tragically. She wrote about her guilt, her belief that she had somehow caused his death. The last entry chilled me to the bone. "I feel him here. He doesn't forgive me. He watches me at night. I don't know how much longer I can endure this." As I closed the diary, the basement lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. And then I heard it. A deep, guttural voice that made my blood run cold. "Why did you bring it back?" I turned and ran, tripping over the steps in my haste to escape. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door and sat trembling, unsure of what to do. The haunting didn't stop. Every night, I heard the whispers, the moaning, the faint sounds of footsteps pacing in the hallway outside my door. One night, I woke to find the porcelain doll from the basement sitting on my nightstand. I hadn't brought it up, and there was no way it could have gotten there on its own. That was the final straw. I packed my things and left the apartment the next day. To this day, I don't know what haunted Mrs. Lorraine or why it seemed to latch onto me after her death, but sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear her voice, faint and pleading, "Help me."
Story number 7.
When I moved into the small, unassuming townhouse on Evergreen Street, I was excited to finally have a place to call my own. It was quiet, nestled in a sleepy cul-de-sac with just a handful of neighbors. Most of the homes were occupied by older residents who kept to themselves, but my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Harriet, was a peculiar exception. From the moment I arrived, I noticed her. She was always watching. Whether I was unloading boxes, trimming the small hedge in front of my house, or even just leaving for work, she was there, peering at me through her lace curtains. It wasn't outright creepy at first, just odd. She was an older woman, perhaps in her late 70s, with a frail frame and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. The first time we spoke, I was taking my trash out to the curb. She shuffled over from her yard, her white hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Hello there," she said, her voice soft but somehow unnervingly hollow. "You've moved into the Johnson house." "Yeah, just a couple of weeks ago," I replied, offering a polite smile. "It's a nice place." Her gaze didn't waver. "Do you know what happened to the family that lived there before you?" I hesitated. "No, I don't. The landlord didn't mention anything." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "They left, in a hurry. Didn't even take all their things." I wasn't sure how to respond, so I nodded awkwardly. "Well, I hope they're okay." She stared at me for a moment longer before muttering, "Be careful," and shuffling back to her house. Her warning lingered in my mind that evening, but I brushed it off as the ramblings of an eccentric older woman. Still, over the next few weeks, strange things started to happen. At first, it was small. Doors I was certain I had closed would be open when I returned to the room. Lights flickered sporadically, even though the wiring had been inspected just before I moved in. And then there were the noises, soft tapping sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls. One night, I woke to a loud crash downstairs. Heart racing, I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and crept down the stairs. The living room was a mess. A framed picture had fallen from the wall, and a chair had been overturned. But what chilled me most was the unmistakable sound of footsteps retreating toward the back door. I searched the house, but found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing out of place, except for the chaos in the living room. The next day, I saw Mrs. Harriet in her front yard. Her piercing eyes met mine, and for the first time, I felt compelled to approach her. "Do you know anything about this house?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Anything? Unusual?" She gave me a long, searching look before sighing. "The Johnsons didn't just leave, they fled. Their little boy Sammy started seeing things, hearing voices. He said someone was living in the walls." I felt a chill run down my spine. Living in the walls? At first, they thought it was just a child's imagination, but then things started happening, objects moving, strange sounds, and then one night, she hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper, they found him in the attic. He was crying, saying someone had tried to pull him into the walls. I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted to laugh it off as an old woman's tale, but another part deep down felt an undeniable sense of dread. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Around midnight, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it was louder, more deliberate, and it seemed to be coming from the wall right behind my headboard. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound stopped. I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall. For a moment, there was nothing. Then faintly, I heard it. A whisper. "Help me." I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was small, childlike, and it sent a wave of cold terror through me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, the power of suggestion after hearing Mrs. Harriet's story. But the next day, I found something that made it impossible to deny. While cleaning out the attic, I discovered an old, dusty shoebox tucked away in a corner. Inside were a few toys, a worn-out baseball glove, and a crumpled piece of paper with childish handwriting. "Mommy, the man in the walls is watching me." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I shoved the box back into the corner and hurried downstairs, Pierre's, trying to shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. That night, the activity escalated. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. I could hear it moving from one wall to another, as though something was crawling inside. And then I heard the whisper again, closer this time. Help me. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a hammer, I began smashing into the wall where the sound was loudest. Plaster and drywall crumbled away, revealing nothing but empty space. But the sound didn't stop. It moved to another wall, taunting me. By dawn, I had torn into 3 walls, my living room a wreck of shattered plaster and debris. But I found nothing. No signs of life, no hidden spaces, nothing to explain the noises. Exhausted and on the verge of tears, I decided to confront Mrs. Harriet again. When I knocked on her door, there was no answer. The house seemed eerily quiet, the curtains drawn tight. I tried knocking again, harder this time, but still nothing. Later that day, I asked another neighbor about her. Their response made my blood run cold. Mrs. Harriet, she passed away 3 years ago. Heart attack in her sleep. No one's lived in that house since. I stood there, stunned. But I've been talking to her. I've seen her. The neighbor gave me a pitying look. You must be mistaken. That house has been empty for years. I didn't go back to my house after that. I packed a bag, checked into a motel, and called a moving company the next day. As I watched the moving truck pull away, I glanced back at the townhouse one last time. In the upstairs window, I saw her, Mrs. Harriet. She was staring at me, her piercing blue eyes filled with something I couldn't quite decipher. And then, just as quickly, she was gone. To this day, I don't know what haunted that house, whether it was the spirit of a frightened child, the ghost of a grieving woman, or something far darker. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the faint tapping, the soft, pleading whisper, "Help me."
Story number 8.
I had lived in my little apartment for just over a year, but there was something about my neighbor, Mrs. Carson, that always made me uneasy. She was an elderly woman who lived in the unit next to mine, and although she kept mostly to herself, there was something about her presence that felt off. It wasn't just her appearance, thin, frail, with sharp, watchful eyes, but the way she moved. She didn't walk like a normal person. It was almost as though she glided, her slippers making no sound as she passed by my door in the hallway. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Everyone has their quirks, right? Maybe she had arthritis, maybe she just preferred to move quietly. But after a few months, I started to notice strange things. Late at night, when the apartment complex was quiet, I'd hear muffled sounds through the walls, scratching, shifting. Sometimes I could hear her talking to herself, but the words were indistinguishable, like she was having an argument with someone who wasn't there. One evening, I was taking the trash out to the bins when I saw Mrs. Carson standing by her door, staring down at the floor. I gave her a polite smile, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were vacant, as if she were lost in thought, or perhaps in a world of her own. I had never seen her act that way before. "Mrs. Carson?" I called out, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" She looked up, and when she met my eyes, there was a strange flicker of recognition, as if she didn't quite know who I was. "I'm fine, dear," she said with a thin smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just thinking about things." I nodded, not wanting to press her further, and went back inside. But the encounter stayed with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice more oddities. Sometimes, when I returned home from work, I'd find the door to her apartment ajar. At first, I thought she had simply forgotten to close it, but after it happened a few times, I began to wonder if she was trying to send some sort of message. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of soft knocks on my door. Groggy, I got out of bed and walked to the door, unsure of who could possibly be visiting at that hour. When I opened the door, Mrs. Carson was standing there. Her eyes were wide, her face pale as a ghost. She was holding a small, old-fashioned key in her hand, and her grip was so tight on it that her knuckles were white. "Mrs. Carson, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice thick with confusion. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared past me into my apartment, her gaze flickering back and forth. "They're here," she whispered hoarsely. "They're waiting for me." I felt a chill run through me. "Who's waiting for you?" but she didn't respond. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her slippers making no sound as she retreated down the hall. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, before closing the door and locking it. I couldn't get the image of her from my mind. The desperation in her eyes, the way she had seemed so disconnected. The next morning, I tried to check on her. Her apartment was eerily quiet, the door locked as usual. I knocked a few times, but there was no answer. I debated whether I should call her son, who I knew lived out of state, but I didn't want to overstep. Mrs. Carson had always been private, and it wasn't my place to intrude. But as the days went on, I began to feel more and more uncomfortable. The sounds in the walls continued, getting louder, more frequent. Scratching, movement. And one night, the knocking returned, this time louder, more insistent. I got up and opened the door, but no one was there. It was then that I heard the whisper, "Help me." I froze. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It came from the direction of Mrs. Carson's apartment. I walked down the hall cautiously, my pulse quickening. When I reached her door, I heard the voice again, clearer now. "Help me, please." I knocked, but there was no response. The door was slightly ajar. Hesitant, I pushed it open, my breath caught in my throat. The apartment was dark except for the flickering light of a lamp in the far corner. The room smelled musty, like old wood and dust. Mrs. Carson's things were scattered about, but she wasn't in sight. I called her name softly, stepping inside. The whispering continued, this time coming from the hallway. I turned toward it, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Mrs. Carson was standing at the end of the hall, her back turned to me. Her head was tilted unnaturally, as though she was listening to something, or someone. "Mrs. Carson?" I called, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Slowly I walked toward her, but the moment I reached out to touch her, she spun around. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her lips trembled as she whispered, "They're here. They won't let me go." Before I could react, she turned and hurried down the hall, disappearing into the darkness of her bedroom. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. The whispering was growing louder, almost as if the walls were alive with it. "Help me," they cried. I ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't stay there any longer. Something was terribly wrong with Mrs. Carson, and I didn't know how to help her. The next day, I finally called her son, explaining what had been happening. He seemed surprised by my concerns, but agreed to come by and check on her. When he arrived, I told him everything, the strange behavior, the whispers, the knocking at night. He listened carefully, his face growing pale as I spoke. I had no idea," he said, looking toward Mrs. Carson's apartment. "She's always been a bit odd, but I never thought it was this bad." Together, we knocked on her door. There was no response. After a few moments, we heard a faint scuffling from inside. Her son tried the handle, but it was locked. He turned to me, his face filled with concern. "I'm going in." I nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a spare key, unlocking the door. When we stepped inside, the apartment was eerily silent. There were no signs of life, nothing moved out of place, until we reached the hallway. There, in the corner of the dark room, was Mrs. Carson. She was standing still, staring at the wall, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Her eyes were wide and unseeing. She's not with us," her son whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "She hasn't been for some time." I stood there, unsure of what to say, as he knelt beside her, trying to shake her out of her stupor, but it was clear. Mrs. Carson was gone. The apartment was sealed, and soon after, her son arranged for everything to be taken care of. But even now, when I walk through the hallway, I can hear it, the soft whispering, the scratch of nails against the walls, and sometimes, late at night, I feel like I'm not alone, like someone is watching me, waiting. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I had always found comfort in the quiet of my suburban neighborhood. The houses were spaced far enough apart that you couldn't hear your neighbors, and everyone kept to themselves. It was the kind of place where you waved at each other when you passed, but rarely went out of your way to strike up a conversation. But there was one neighbor who always intrigued me, the elderly man who lived next door to me, Mr. Ellis. Mr. Ellis had lived in the house next to mine for as long as I could remember. I'd seen him around occasionally, always wearing the same gray cardigan and slacks, his white hair combed neatly, his glasses perched low on his nose. He was quiet, polite, light when spoken to, but he never initiated conversation. Over time, I stopped seeing him as much. His lawn began to grow a little longer, and the blinds in his windows stayed closed more often. When I'd look out my window, I rarely saw him walking around anymore. I figured he was just getting older and maybe had trouble getting around. One evening, I came home from work and noticed that Mr. Ellis's front door was wide open, the screen door banging against the frame in the wind. I found it odd, as he always kept his door shut. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to check if he needed help. I knocked gently at first, then louder when there was no answer. After a moment, the door creaked open slightly, and I called inside. "Mr. Ellis, are you all right?" There was no response. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just leave, but something about the open door felt wrong. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet. The faint scent of something old, like mothballs and dust, filled the air. "Mr. Ellis?" I called again, my voice echoing in the stillness. I walked down the narrow hallway, passing old family photos that lined the walls. They were mostly faded and yellowed with age, but one photo caught my eye, a picture of Mr. Ellis with a woman and a young girl, both smiling. I had never seen them before. I moved toward the living room, but the room was empty, save for a chair by the window and a stack of books on the table. Then I noticed something strange. On the floor near the window, there was a piece of paper. It was crumpled, as if it had been thrown there in frustration. I bent down to pick it up. It was a letter written in neat, careful handwriting. As I unfolded it, I read the words, "I can't stay here anymore. She's back. I need to leave before it's too late." I felt a chill run through me. I didn't understand what the letter meant, but the unease I'd been feeling deepened. I glanced around, noticing a few things out of place. A lamp was turned on, but the room felt dim, as if the light was flickering in and out. The air was stale, as if it hadn't been breathed in for days. I made my way upstairs, hoping to find Mr. Ellis in his bedroom, maybe sick or asleep. The staircase creaked beneath my feet as I ascended. When I reached the top, I saw that the door to his bedroom was cracked open. I knocked softly before pushing it open. Mr. Ellis was sitting in a chair by the window, his back to me. He didn't seem to notice me. His hands were trembling as he held onto the armrests, and his head was down as if he were praying. "Mr. Ellis?" I said softly, stepping closer. He jerked his head up at the sound of my voice, his eyes wide with fear. There was something in his expression that made my stomach drop, a look of terror, as if he had seen something that I couldn't. "Mr. Ellis, are you all right?" I asked again, trying to steady my voice. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me as though trying to place me. His lips parted, but nothing came out. After a long moment, he finally said, "You shouldn't be here." I frowned, confused. "Why? What's going on? Is there something I can help you with?" He shook his head slowly. "She's here," he whispered, his voice shaking. "She's come back. I can't leave. She won't let me." The room felt colder suddenly, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees. My skin prickled with an uncanny sense of dread, and I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone else there, but it was empty. "Who's here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who won't let you leave?" He didn't respond. Instead, he stood up shakily, his hand clutching the armrest for support. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he were afraid of what might happen if he made a sudden move. He started to walk toward the door, muttering under his breath, "I have to go. I have to leave before she comes back." I reached out to stop him, but as I touched his arm, a wave of coldness washed over me, and I froze. His skin was icy, unnaturally so. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "Mr. Ellis, please," I said, panic rising in my chest. "Let me help you. What do you mean by she's here? Who are you talking about?" He stopped in the doorway, his back to me, and for a brief moment I thought he might actually leave. But then, just as suddenly as he had stopped, he turned to face me. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. His lips trembled as he spoke again, but his words were incomprehensible. They were like a jumbled mess of sounds, something not quite human. Then, in a flash, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped even further, and I felt a presence in the room, something that I couldn't see but that I could feel, pressing down on me like a weight. My breath caught in my throat, and I could hear faint whispering coming from the corner of the room, as though someone or something was speaking in hushed tones. I turned toward the corner, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel the air around me thickening, like it was closing in. "Leave!" Mr. Ellis screamed, his voice a shrill cry. "She's going to take you too!" I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't need to. I backed away slowly, fear gripping me tightly. I ran down the stairs and out of the house, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled into the yard, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Mr. Ellis's terrified face haunted me, as did the eerie feeling that something had been in that house with us. The whispers, the coldness, the strange letter. It was as if the house itself had been alive with something malevolent, something waiting. The next morning, I called the police, but when they arrived, Mr. Ellis's house was empty. There were no signs of him, no trace of his belongings. The door had been locked, the windows shut tight, no one had seen him leave. The police searched the house, but found nothing unusual. I was left with my own thoughts, my memories of that night, and the unsettling feeling that Mr. Ellis hadn't just disappeared. He had been taken by something in that house, something that was still there, lurking in the shadows. I never saw Mr. Ellis again, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something in that house still watches me. Occasionally, when I walk past it, I hear faint whispers on the wind, too soft to make out but unmistakable. And sometimes I swear I can see a figure in the window, watching me just as Mr. Ellis had once watched me. I don't know what happened to him, but I can't help but feel that whatever was in that house still there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I had lived in my apartment for a few months before I even noticed the neighbor next door. At first, I thought nothing of it. Just a regular building with regular tenants. My unit was at the far end of the hall, and the apartment beside mine always seemed to be empty, or at least I never heard anything from it. But that changed one evening. I was coming home from work when I noticed a light on in the apartment next door. This was unusual because the place had been dark every time I'd passed by before. Curiosity got the best of me, so I stopped for a moment, wondering who had moved in. I didn't hear any noise, but I did see the flicker of a TV or a lamp behind the window. I turned away, deciding not to investigate further, but it gnawed at me a little. Who was the new neighbor? The next morning, I ran into her in the hallway. "Hi, I'm your neighbor from next door," she said. Her voice was quiet but friendly, and her smile was warm, though there was a hint of something I couldn't quite place. Her name was Sarah, and she had just moved in, she explained. She looked to be in her late 20s, short, with dark hair that framed her face. Her clothes were simple, though she carried an air of elegance in the way she stood. There was something a little off about her, but I couldn't quite pinpoint it. Over the next few weeks, I would see Sarah here and there, always alone, always quiet. She would smile when we crossed paths, but she didn't engage in much conversation. I didn't mind. I was a pretty private person myself. But then the strange occurrences started. It began with the noise. It was subtle at first, just a soft scratching sound at night. At first I figured it was the wind or maybe the old pipes in the walls, but after a few nights of hearing it, I started to wonder. The scratching would start around midnight, sometimes even later, and it would last for hours. It wasn't a consistent sound. It would be as though someone was lightly tapping or scratching on the walls. At first, I thought it might be a rodent or a neighbor's pet, but it didn't sound quite like that. There was something deliberate about it. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the odd quirks of living in an older building. But then, I heard it while Sarah was in the hallway one day. I was just coming out of my apartment, and I saw her standing outside her door, looking at something on her phone. "Hey, Sarah," I said, trying to make casual conversation. She looked up, her expression blank for a moment before she smiled and greeted me back. "Is everything okay?" I asked, suddenly feeling the urge to check in. I hadn't seen her much lately. She nodded quickly. "Yeah, everything's fine, just tired." Before I could ask anything further, the sound started. The scratching, faint at first, began in the walls between our apartments. Sarah didn't seem to notice, but I felt my stomach twist. It was too close. It was as though whatever was causing it was coming from her apartment. "Sorry," I said, trying to ignore the strange sensation I was feeling. Is that noise normal? Sarah didn't seem bothered by it. What noise? I paused, taken aback. The scratching was unmistakable. It wasn't the pipes, it was something else. Maybe it's just the old building, she said, brushing off my concern with a laugh. I haven't heard it, but I wouldn't worry about it. I'm sure it's nothing. The conversation ended quickly after that, and I returned to my apartment feeling unsettled. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with the whole situation. Over the next few days, the scratching continued, but now I heard it more clearly. It wasn't just random noises. It sounded like something, or someone, was deliberately scraping against the wall, almost like they were trying to communicate. I tried to talk to Sarah about it again the following week, but it was as if she was avoiding me. She didn't seem to want to acknowledge the noise, or maybe she didn't hear it. It didn't make sense. The more I thought about it, the more I started to wonder if I was imagining things. Maybe I was just overstressed from work, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Then came the night that changed everything. I had just returned home from a late shift when I noticed Sarah's door was slightly open. I stopped in the hallway, feeling a shiver run down my spine. It was late. Too late for her to be leaving her door unlocked. I considered knocking to check on her, but something held me back. Something in the air felt wrong. I stood there for a moment, indecisive. My stomach churned as the scratching sound began again. Louder now, more frantic. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from inside Sarah's apartment. I couldn't help myself. I walked toward her door, drawn by some force I couldn't explain. The closer I got, the louder the sound became. It was almost like the scratching had turned into something more. A scraping, a tapping, a thudding. Before I could stop myself, I pushed the door open slightly. The apartment was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlight outside coming through the window. But what I saw in the faint light made my breath catch in my throat. Sarah was standing in the center of the living room, facing the wall. Her back was straight, her hands limp by her sides. The scratching noise was louder now, but it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from behind her, from the corner of the room. And then I saw it. There was a figure in the corner, barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. A person, or something like a person, standing still and unmoving. The figure was hunched over, its arms twisted at odd angles. It was as if it was trying to remain hidden, but the faint outline of its form was clear enough. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen to the spot. My heart hammered in my chest. Then, Sarah turned her head slowly, as if she had felt my presence. When she looked at me, her eyes were wide, unnaturally wide, too large for her face. Her mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, too unnatural. "Leave now," she whispered, her voice strange and hollow. "You shouldn't have seen this." I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, my mind racing. I didn't wait for another word. I turned and ran back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next day, I didn't see Sarah. I didn't hear any sounds from her apartment either. It was as if she had vanished. I went to the building manager, but they told me they hadn't seen her either. Her apartment was locked, no signs of her leaving, no notice given. It was as if she had disappeared. That was a few months ago now. I still hear the occasional scratching sound from the walls. Sometimes it's faint, almost imperceptible. Other times it's more urgent, louder, closer. But Sarah is gone. At least I think she is. Every now and then when I walk past her apartment, I feel something. A presence, a coldness that wasn't there before. And sometimes when I look at the window, I swear I can see her standing there, just out of sight, watching me. I don't know if it's her or if it's something else, but I've learned not to get too close.